By 1943, the Soviet Union believed it had mastered the art of defeating the German army. The formula that had brought victory at Stalingrad seemed foolproof. Surround the enemy in a pincer movement. Cut off their escape, and slowly squeeze the life out of them until every last man was either dead or forced to surrender. But that formula shattered when they reached the Taman Peninsula. Here the landscape itself turned against them. The terrain was a nightmare, a narrow, swamp-choked spit of mud wedged between the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. It was a bottleneck where movement was limited, and the idea of encirclement became impossible. The land was simply unflankable. The Germans had taken full advantage of this terrain. They transformed the peninsula into a fortress of steel and stone, surrounded by an unbroken wall of bunkers, barbed wire, and minefields so thick that soldiers said they could plow it like farmland. At the heart of this defensive labyrinth stood the Red House, a twisted hulk of concrete buried within the broken city of Novorossiysk. It clung to the ruins like a tumor to the bone, a monstrous fortress designed not just to defend, but to kill, to drain the attackers of every drop of blood and spirit. Hitler was confident that this stronghold could withstand assault for a full year. Stalin, however, had no patience for delay. He gave his men 30 days. 30 days to crush the Germans or die where they stood. No retreat, no surrender, victory or death. In the early months of 1943, the Soviet forces had surged forward, recapturing territory inch by inch. They liberated the Kuban region through relentless fighting, pushing through mud, blood, and fire. Their momentum seemed unstoppable. But that forward drive came to a sudden halt when they reached what the Germans called the Blue Line. It was more than a defensive barrier. It was a masterpiece of engineering and cruelty. General Erwin Janicki, a calculating and determined commander, had transformed the Taman Peninsula into one of the most formidable fortresses on the Eastern Front. His 17th Army, over 400,000 strong, waited behind defenses that dwarfed even the infamous Atlantic Wall. Nearly 3,000 guns, over 100 tanks, and hundreds of aircraft stood ready. Yet the true brilliance of the defense lay not in numbers, but in design. The Blue Line stretched from the shores of the Azov Sea down along the Kurka River. The Germans had reshaped the land itself. They built an immense earthen embankment on the river's western bank, turning it into a natural moat that could drown whole divisions. Beyond it lay swamps and flooded plains that swallowed tanks and men alike. The northern approach was even deadlier. Narrow channels hemmed in by marshes, where one well-placed machine gun could pin down an entire regiment for days, even weeks. In the center, there was only a narrow strip of solid ground, 20 meters of dry earth that looked like hope to Soviet tank commanders but was really a death trap. There, the Germans had built two sprawling mazes of concrete bunkers, connected by deep trenches and shielded by the densest minefields the Eastern Front had ever seen. Further south, near Novorossiysk, the mountains became fortresses themselves. The Germans had transformed entire neighborhoods into strongholds. Basements were connected by reinforced tunnels. Buildings were packed with explosives, and streets were barricaded with rubble and mines. Behind the Blue Line were more layers of defense: the Bucharest Line, the Berlin Line, Munich, Stuttgart, and Ulm. Each one was another wall of death, each one a fallback point to prolong the fight. The Germans even built what they called the Little Gothic Line, stretching from the town of Triuc all the way to the Black Sea. Hitler referred to this entire region as Fortress Taman, one of his final hopes of stopping the Soviet advance. If his northern offensive succeeded, this stronghold would serve as the launchpad to recapture the oil-rich Caucasus fields that Germany so desperately needed. But reality was beginning to crush the German dream. The once unbeatable Wehrmacht was bleeding, worn down by the unending war and the brutal Soviet push. Since early February, a small Soviet beachhead had clung stubbornly to life near Novorossiysk. The Germans had tried again and again to wipe it out, but it endured. Among the Red Army soldiers, it became known with pride and defiance as the Little Land. It was a symbol of resistance, a patch of Soviet soil that refused to die no matter how many bombs fell or shells exploded. Commanding these forces was Colonel General Ivan Petrov, a man as tough as the terrain he fought on. He had a daring plan. Strike Novorossiysk, where the Soviet Black Sea Fleet could support the attack with heavy naval gunfire. Break through the blue line there, and the German flank would crumble. The defenders of Fortress Taman would find themselves cut off, and the Red Army could finally roll across the peninsula. Among Petrov's forces was a special regiment that had already become legendary, the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment. The Germans had a name for them that mixed both fear and mockery: Nachthexen, the Night Witches. On the night of September 10, 1943, the Soviet attack began. Over 200 artillery guns roared at once, shaking the earth. The thunder rolled across the sea, echoing through the mountains. Then from the darkness came the Night Witches. Young women, many barely 20 years old, climbed into their rickety Po-2 biplanes, old wooden training aircraft covered in canvas, slow and fragile but reliable. They carried small bombs strapped under their wings, and their courage was their only armor. Climbing to 1,200 meters, they cut their engines over the target area and glided silently through the black sky. The only sound was the eerie whoosh of wind through their wings. For the German soldiers on the ground, it was a haunting sound, like the whisper of ghosts before the storm. A moment later came the explosions. Ammunition depots erupted in fire. The October cement factory was torn apart by flames. Panic spread through the German lines as searchlights swept across the night sky, their beams slicing through smoke and clouds in search of the invisible bombers. When the lights finally found the slow-moving shapes, the anti-aircraft guns opened fire, turning the heavens into a storm of steel and fire. Then came the German night fighters. Fast, merciless, and equipped with radar, they hunted the Po-2s like wolves. One after another, the fragile Soviet planes burst into flames. 4 went down almost instantly, spiraling toward the earth like falling stars. The ground trembled as they hit. 8 young women, brave, determined, and barely more than girls, were burned alive in their cockpits. Yet even as their comrades fell, more night witches kept flying through the darkness, their courage undimmed. To them, fear was a luxury they could no longer afford. Each flight was a dance with death, and every bomb they dropped brought them one step closer to victory. The survivors of the night witches pressed on despite the chaos that filled the night sky. Smoke and flames swirled beneath their fragile wooden wings as they released their remaining bombs over the harbor. Many of their aircraft were riddled with bullet holes, engines coughing, wings torn, but they stayed in the air long enough to strike one last blow before limping home toward their base. Behind them came the might of the Soviet Fourth Air Army, 150 aircraft filling the sky, their engines roaring as they turned the darkness above Novorossiysk into a burning storm of light and thunder. Explosions lit up the harbor, the flames reflecting off the Black Sea like molten glass. After 7 long months of preparation, the full assault on the Blue Line had finally begun. Down below, the Soviet naval forces joined the attack. Sleek torpedo boats sliced through the waves at full speed, charging straight into the harbor through the thick smoke. They didn't waste their torpedoes on enemy ships. Instead, they aimed them directly at the German defenses, the piers, jetties, and fortified positions. Walls of water erupted as explosions tore through the docks, splintering wood and concrete alike. The shockwaves rolled through the port, shaking even the strongest bunkers. Behind the torpedo boats came smaller cutters packed tightly with assault troops. 3 battalions of Soviet naval infantry and NKVD soldiers stormed the burning docks under relentless enemy fire. Bullets hissed through the smoke as men leaped into the freezing water, clawing their way to shore. It was chaos, the roar of engines, the scream of artillery, and the cries of men echoing across the harbor. At 3:15 a.m., the main Soviet ground forces began their advance. The Western group surged out from the Miskako beachhead, that small, stubborn patch of land known as the Little Land, which had endured 7 months of unbroken German bombardment and assaults. Those men knew what endurance meant, and now it was their turn to strike back. To the east, another Soviet force fought its way through the jagged mountain terrain north of Novorossiysk, struggling through narrow passes that funneled them directly into the teeth of German defenses. Both groups ran headlong into a wall of fire. The Germans had prepared for this moment for months. Artillery, machine guns, and mortars unleashed a storm of steel, cutting down entire companies as they tried to move forward. Reinforcements poured in from both sides. Within hours, the Soviet naval infantry and NKVD battalions had been torn apart by the sheer volume of German fire. Streets became rivers of rubble and blood. Only one Soviet unit, the 1339th Rifle Regiment, managed to hold its ground near the harbor, clinging to a handful of shattered buildings as German counterattacks slammed into them from all directions. By nightfall, they were surrounded, exhausted, and running low on ammunition. The 1337th Rifle Regiment fought desperately to reach them, advancing meter by meter through streets swept by machine gun fire. Every step forward was paid for in blood, but by dawn, they finally broke through and linked up with the remnants of the 1339th. The surviving soldiers were blackened with soot and grime, their faces hollow from sleepless nights. But they refused to break. At sunrise on September 11th, a spark of hope appeared. Reinforced with tanks, the Eastern Soviet group smashed into the massive October cement factory, one of the strongest points in the German line. Soviet shells pounded the walls until they crumbled, and then the tanks surged through the gaps. German defenders fought ferociously, firing from windows, rubble piles, and underground bunkers, but the Soviet momentum was unstoppable. The Blue Line, that seemingly impenetrable wall of German defenses, was finally breached. For the first time in 7 months, the Soviets had pierced the fortress that had held them back. Further north, the 9th Soviet Army tried to do the same, slogging through endless marshes. The land was a nightmare, every step a battle against sucking mud and tangled roots. The Germans had flooded the terrain, creating natural traps. The Soviets advanced chest-deep in water, their rifles held above their heads. They couldn't break through the narrow channels guarded by German guns, but their attacks achieved one crucial goal. They kept the Germans pinned down and unable to send reinforcements south to Novorossiysk. By now, the German High Command knew the truth. The Taman Peninsula could not be held. Even before the final assaults began, Hitler had privately admitted as much. On September 4th, he had authorized Field Marshal von Manstein to begin a withdrawal if necessary. With Soviet armor now loose in Novorossiysk and the Blue Line broken, the decision was made. The 17th German Army began a massive evacuation across the narrow Kerch Straits to Crimea. It would be carried out with brutal precision, cold, methodical, and deadly to anyone who stood in the way. Inside Novorossiysk, one of the bloodiest battles centered on a single building, an apartment block turned fortress, known to both sides as the Red House. It had become a symbol of defiance for the Germans and a nightmare for the Soviets. The first Soviet assault waves were cut down in the open as machine guns spat fire from every window and doorway. Snipers hid in the shadows, picking off Soviet gunners before they could even aim their weapons. Soviet tanks and self-propelled guns rolled forward, pounding the structure with shell after shell, tearing through walls and floors. The air filled with dust, smoke, and the thunder of explosions. But the Germans had built their defenses deep into the earth. They fired from tunnels and basements that connected the ruins underground, turning the entire block into a deadly maze. Finally, Soviet combat engineers crawled forward with explosives strapped to their backs. Covered by tank fire, they reached the foundation and planted their charges. Moments later, the Red House vanished in a roar of fire and concrete, collapsing into itself and burying the defenders alive. While victory in the city lifted Soviet spirits, the fighting elsewhere was far from easy. On September 14th, the 56th Army launched an assault on the central sector of the Blue Line, one of the most heavily fortified positions on the entire peninsula. Soviet tanks advanced bravely, but came under direct fire from German 88mm guns. They reached the edge of the minefields and halted. Engineers dashed forward under fire to clear a path, detonating mines and blowing gaps. But as soon as the first tanks moved through, German anti-tank crews opened up. Flames consumed every vehicle that left the safety of the cleared lanes. The infantry, suddenly cut off from armor support, went to ground. The assault failed, leaving hundreds of burning wrecks scattered across the field. The next day, September 15th, the Soviets regrouped and attacked again with everything they had. This time, the tanks broke through the forward trenches, crushing German positions under their treads. To the south, the 18th Army captured Sugarhead Mountain, opening the final road to Novorossiysk. Realizing the danger of encirclement, the German 4th Mountain Division began a fighting withdrawal. Their lines were collapsing everywhere. By nightfall on September 16th, the Soviet flag was raised over the city. After 7 months of brutal occupation, Novorossiysk was free once again. The port, the harbor, and the city that had once symbolized German dominance now lay in Soviet hands. But the battle was not over. To the north, the Ninth Army faced a hellish pursuit across the marshes. Soldiers moved chest-deep through foul water, sometimes using inflated inner tubes to keep afloat. Many had no boats and trudged forward on foot, their weapons wrapped in rags to keep them dry. Romanian mountain troops and dismounted cavalry fought bitterly, defending every scrap of solid ground. The Germans fell back slowly, leaving traps, ambushes, and mines in their wake. The Soviets advanced, but each meter came at a terrible cost. Further south, Soviet tanks from the 18th Army smashed through to the coastal city of Anapa on September 20th. After a full day of street fighting, the Red Army took the port. Across the Kerch Straits, German evacuation ships worked day and night under the protection of smoke screens and heavy artillery. The Soviets tried to cut off the escape, launching small amphibious assaults between lagoons and marshes, but every landing was met with fierce resistance. The Germans were determined. They would not let their army be trapped. On the night of September 25th, the Soviets made one final desperate gamble. They launched their largest amphibious operation yet, landing 8,500 men near Salt Lake, hoping to cut off the German evacuation. Their goal was the city of Taman itself. If they could capture it, they could close the door on the German retreat. For 2 days, Soviet troops fought savage battles against German rearguards, supported by every available aircraft from the Black Sea Fleet. Yet the Germans fought with grim efficiency, holding just long enough for their evacuation to continue. Amazingly, the Germans had even transported an entire mine-sweeping flotilla overland from the Baltic, 64 massive trucks carrying boats and equipment. Their logistics were astonishingly well coordinated. Night after night, ships ferried soldiers, guns, and supplies across the strait. By the time the operation ended, 255,000 Axis soldiers, 21,000 vehicles, 800 guns, and 74,000 horses had escaped. The Soviets bombed ports, shelled embarkation points, and sent aircraft to intercept, but the evacuation never stopped. The final German perimeter was held by the 97th Light Division and the 4th Mountain Division. At dawn on October 9th, Generals Rudolf Conrad and Erwin Janicki boarded the last boat and crossed to Crimea. Behind them, German heavy artillery on the far shore fired one final protective barrage across the water. When Soviet troops finally stormed the empty German positions, they found nothing left but rubble and ashes. Everything of value had been destroyed. The Soviet victory came at a heavy price. They had reclaimed the Taman Peninsula in record time, sealing the route to the Caucasus forever. But their failure to stop the German escape left a bitter taste. The losses were staggering. The Germans suffered over 10,000 casualties, including several division commanders, and more than 36,000 wounded. Romanian forces lost another 1,600 men. But the Soviet toll was far higher, 114,000 casualties with over 40,000 dead. Still, despite the bloodshed and exhaustion, the Soviets had finally done what once seemed impossible. The Taman Peninsula, once thought to be impregnable, was theirs. In recognition of their escape, Hitler awarded his soldiers a new decoration, the Kuban Shield. And when Soviet soldiers wandered through the ruins the Germans had left behind, they found a chilling message scrawled on a wooden sign among the rubble. Here, the iron crosses grow. It was both a taunt and an epitaph, a reminder of how much had been lost on both sides, and how even in victory, war left behind nothing but ghosts. As the smoke cleared over the Taman Peninsula, the echoes of battle slowly faded into the sea breeze. The land that had once been a fortress of steel and fire now stood silent, marked by the sacrifice of thousands who had fought there. The Soviet troops who walked through the ruins knew the price of victory. It was written in every crater, every shattered building, and every nameless grave. The Germans had escaped, but their retreat could not erase what had happened here. The balance of power had shifted, and with the liberation of Novorossiysk, the path toward Crimea, and the final reckoning on the Eastern Front, had begun. The story of the Taman Peninsula was not just one of strategy and soldiers. It was a story of endurance, courage, and the unbreakable will of men who refused to surrender, no matter the odds. These moments remind us that history is built not only on victories, but on the heavy price paid to achieve them. Thank you for watching WW2 Files, where we bring forgotten battles and untold stories of the Second World War back to life. Stay with us for more powerful tales of courage, sacrifice, and survival from the greatest conflict in human history.